It's got hot and dry again. How are you? Welcome back. Starting to feel a little bit like Groundhog Day, isn't it? Last year, 2025, being the record year in the UK for lack of rainfall. And this year hasn't necessarily been quite as dry so soon in particular. Last year's drought probably kicked in from April, May time, didn't it? Really had issues with spring crops being established and emerging through lack of moisture that then continued. We haven't had as much of that this year, I think it's fair to say, especially in those more droughted out regions from last year. I know further north you go, they've had significant rainfall this spring. But it's this intense level of heat that we're now having to at least try and manage our ways round. You could argue that in some cases, in some regions, we're actually as dry now after our third heat wave with a potential fourth at the end of July on its way. Yes, as I say, further north, parts of the west where you have had that moisture, the combination of this heat has been tremendous, as per last year. But what do we do if it is that we are facing another year where the extreme weather is starting to play an impact in terms of our forage availability, whether it be cutting or grazing? Do we just keep hoping for the best? Or do we look at trying to do something different? Now, the word resilience is a word that comes up very often at the moment, isn't it? And I am getting a little bit concerned it is possibly getting a little bit overused, and therefore the strength and the importance of it getting diluted. There's been a lot of debate across the UK with regards to how the UK is able to manage and cope with this heat, even if it's just general day to day. There's been those conversations around schools closing, about the fact that this is what we just used to refer to as summer. And I get all that. But my argument would be is, are we actually set up for it? That's a limiting factor. In the same way that we'd like to have aircon potentially in our buildings going forward, if it is that this is what we're going to have to get more used to, therefore to make it or make us more resilient to those types of conditions, I do firmly believe that we also need to start addressing and looking at that within our forages too. We can't put a post out online saying this is what we just used to call summer, and then 2 weeks later put another post out saying the fact that we're having to start full winter rations from that forage that we were able to produce earlier on in the year, because basically grass has dried out and properly on the back foot already in the summer. Now, where I am today is probably only 40 minutes north of where I live in Shropshire, just over the Cheshire border. And actually I would say that in the grand scheme of things, it's a fair bit greener here than even it is that little bit further south. And of course it only goes one way as you get further south from us with regards to the drought conditions. It's also starting to impact the likes of the northeast, areas of Yorkshire that we saw last year too. And of course the most recent wildfires throughout the UK are just a true picture of just where the country is currently up to with regards to its state of moisture, or at least the lack of moisture, and the conditions and those extreme conditions that it has around it at the moment. In a year such as this, which like I say, this is the second year on the bounce now, we often see those comments of, you know, the only thing that's growing out there are the docks. And there is something to take from that. Why is it that the docks, the weed species that we're normally chasing out of the field, are actually able to thrive in conditions that we've been handed, in particular over the last 2 years? It's because of their rooting capabilities, of course. Those deep tap roots that make them a pest to try and get rid of are actually a strength in situations that we have now. So why is it that we don't always necessarily, at any given opportunity or enough opportunity, consider looking at that element of root establishment, looking at that diversity of rooting structure to give us strengths within the seeds that we actually try and establish within our own forage rotations? Now, that's possibly a bit of a broad sweeping statement, and I appreciate there are a lot of growers throughout the UK who are looking at differences and especially the diversities within their forage. But there are elements that we can pull out of those. There are strengths to these certain species and varieties that are now coming to the forefront through the likes of SFI and schemes. But today we're going to park schemes, SFI requirements all to one side. I'm going to utilise the field that I'm in today that is part of SFI to actually start trying to identify and highlight some of the strengths that some of these species can give us. Yes, they won't be the silver bullet. they won't be necessarily able to maintain that overall yield that we're expecting to get from the more intensive systems. But if it is that we can start looking at incorporating some of these, they may well just give us that little bit of buffer, that little bit of a lifeline through conditions and times when actually something is always going to be better than nothing. So similar to those comments with regards to those weed species that are notorious for doing well in dry conditions, almost rubbing salt into a bit of a wound when your established grass behind it isn't necessarily doing as well. We can pick up on those same sorts of traits and comments from the species in the likes of these herbal lays, multi-species mixtures, whatever we're going to call them. And let me just flip the camera around so we can just take a little bit of a closer look at this field and see how the different elements are performing or not performing in the current conditions that we have. So this mixture was established around about 3 years ago for the benefits of SFI as a multi-species mixture. The mixture contains both the grasses, the legumes and the herbs required to meet the aims of the scheme. And as you can already see, the likes of the plantain, the red and the white clovers in particular, haven't really looked back. However, if it is that we look at the grass fraction within here, that's really hit a wall. This is where the benefits of these sorts of types of mixtures can come from. The fact that the elements of the legumes and herbs can carry on in the most testing of conditions. And we know that the likes of these legumes and herbs, this is one of their party tricks, of course. That diverse and deep rooting system that enables them to keep growing and keep producing at least something in very dry and intense conditions. You can hear it under my feet, the grass crunching away. You can see it in the background in particular where the tankers have been. That the grass is basically sat on the back foot now, just waiting for moisture. If it is that we are solely reliant on moisture to produce these crops, that is going to become more and more of a limiting factor potentially as we go forward. Now the benefits of the likes of legumes and herbs is multifaceted. It's not just that rooting capability that allows them to grow in conditions that we're currently facing over the last 2 years. Of course, they're high in protein. They fix nitrogen as they go. They also mine minerals from the soil to increase the levels of quality within our forage. Now, I'm not expecting that these will be an option for everybody, but for example, within grazing regimes, if this could be the difference between having either fields that are the same colour as those wheelings there, or the rest of it, as I say, something is always going to be better than nothing. And of course they fit in well because of those characteristics, that they fix your nitrogen, that they increase your feed quality too, in any given year, whatever a normal year might or might not look like now. So considering these sorts of types of strengths and adding this sort of type of diversity within our swards going forward, I believe is starting to get more and more important as the years progress. And regardless of any major requirement for these and the strengths from a drought point of view, these sorts of types of mixtures, even on a higher inclusion percentage of this, are fantastic mixtures, in particular for finishing the likes of lambs and cattle on too. That smorgasbord of diversity, that bit of everything that's going on in there, is a real rocket fuel sort of type situation for ensuring that we have high quality forage coming at livestock, regardless of the conditions that are thrown at us. But of course, we can only hope that actually these extreme conditions do start settling down and getting to a little bit more of an even keel. But in the current climate, I don't think hope is necessarily enough. And as I said, I appreciate that these sorts of types of options aren't necessarily the silver bullet, especially for those more intense cutting situations. This year, I don't think I'll have had as many questions with regards to lucerne popping up into inquiries as I've had for a long time. Again, looking at that ability to shoulder these dry periods of weather, but still maintain yield, but of course that incredible quality that it can offer too. And going back to those comments that again, I fully appreciate with regards to this is just summer, it is what it is. But it's different now. I don't think we've ever seen these levels of extreme, but also the margins aren't there either. If it is that we're all getting paid good values for whatever output that it is within our farming system, you can ride a bit of this sort of type of situation. When it is that the margins are so tight, this is where the margin of error gets much smaller too. And that is what we're trying to mitigate. And that is what I think we really need to be looking at to try and reduce the risk going forward. And it's weird to think, isn't it, that as these conditions progress and if this does become more of the norm, actually those in the south are arguably becoming just as more marginal as those in the north with that shorter growing window. Yes, we have those long winters still, but actually the windows for actual production over the summer and the spring are getting tighter and tighter. So the importance and the reliability to get as much out of our forage as we possibly can is getting more important than ever. Now, since you last seen me, I was fortunate to be part of a podcast for the cereals event down at Diddley Squat. That podcast discussed resilient soils and seed. And I would argue now that actually now is the time that we need to start addressing and questioning what it is that we do. On that podcast, I mentioned the fact that farming in many ways can get very routine. That day-to-day routine, that season-by-season routine. And even our decisions and our choices around those seasons and those cropping options can almost get routine too. My one specific piece of advice for this autumn, especially as we go into this autumn looking to establish potentially new swards maybe, is just stop. Ask yourself why. Why are you doing that? What is it that you could possibly look at doing slightly different? It doesn't have to be the likes of legumes and herbs if you don't think that that's going to fit your scenario. However, we can see the benefits in situations such as this. But also look at different species of grass maybe. There are more drought resistant species, the likes of fesculoliums, a cross between a perennial ryegrass and a fescue. So taking the benefit of that fescue rooting capability, but maintaining the yield and quality of a perennial. Start stitching that little bit more diversity into it, and I hope that actually we don't ever need to call on them. However, having them there, having them as an option, ensures that if we do need to call them on an hour of need, such as the last 2 years, they are in our system to carry some of that risk associated with the dry conditions. Now, it may well be that you don't feel that these sorts of types of mixtures could fit your system, especially from a weed control point of view maybe. And again, totally understand that. Especially if it's older ground that we're turning over and waking up a significant weed bank, our options of weed control in these sorts of types of crops is very limited. However, we've also discussed in the past on those previous videos the fact that if you get the likes of chickweed or fat hen in there, normally a good grazing or a cutting tends to get rid of those. But if it is that you are still concerned about that, consider doing something like a stale seed bed maybe. Work the ground down, get it ready for seed establishment, but let those weed species bounce and then spray it off before you go and drill your required mixture. But don't let that, or elements such as that, be a hurdle for potentially gaining the benefits of certain species such as this. And lastly, as I say, whether this is going to be conditions that are yet to stay or continue, I do believe that we need to start thinking about our forage and how it works in times such as this. We have our protein crops, we have our starch crops in rotations, and we have our forage crops. It's getting more and more important to almost have our summer forage that is slightly different to the regular, to ensure that we've got it there as a bit of a safety net. Also, going back to the conversations we've had over the winter about the likes of producing as much forage over those winter months as we possibly can, to front load forage into our springs, to take basically the responsibility off the rest of our existing forage to maintain yield and quality. Looking at those options in between our maize crops, whether it be the likes of Italians if we prefer the grass root, or forage rye, massively mitigate the risk and take the pressure off forage supplies for whatever year that we're now given. This year is looking as though it's going to be another early harvest for maize if everything continues the way it is now. So again, establishing those in good order in combination with moisture all being well will give us hopefully some significant forage potential over the winter, taken off early in the spring to then go back into maize again, all part of the rotation. So it's all about looking at your individual situation, your individual soil types, and mitigating that risk, and basically adding that diversity in there to mitigate the pressures of drought. So there's just a bit of food for thought for me from what I'm starting to see as these conditions start to bite now once again. As I say, there are opportunities that are already existing in terms of increasing protein, fixing nitrogen, reducing input costs from the likes of fertiliser and bought-in feed regardless. But if it is, we can stitch in that resilience from a drought tolerance point of view, even better again. As ever, if you've liked this video, please like it, share it, subscribe and click that little bell, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye for now. Now, one very last point from me is I appreciate that a lot of the species that go into these sorts of types of options aren't necessarily every grower's forte. That's fully understandable. You're not always required to know about them or be involved with them before. We've seen those conversations, those questions actually coming out of the likes of SFI over the last few years. But don't let that be a limiting factor. Don't see them as a daft question maybe. There are plenty of people out in the UK seed industry that can help you with the advice and the input as to what could work for you to potentially transform or at least give an element of risk share within your rotation and your forage production for these challenging conditions. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.